Good afternoon, and welcome to the 11th Annual Getzen Lecture on Government Accountability, hosted by the Department of Public Administration and Policy, and that department is in the School of Public and International Affairs. I'm Robert Grafstein. I'm the interim dean of the school, and before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to introduce some people who have joined us today. From the university, Laura Meadows is the director of the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, soon to be the interim vice president for public services outreach. Welcome to the interim community. And we have a number of leaders from the law enforcement community who have joined us today. Ira Edwards, Sheriff of Athens-Clarke County, Scott Freeman, Chief of Police, Athens-Clarke County, and Jimmy Williamson, Chief of Police for the University of Georgia. And I think we're going to be safe this afternoon. So thank you all for being here today. I also want to note that there are many members of the SPIA faculty here. I especially want to recognize Brad Wright, who's head of the Department of Public Administration and Policy, and Brian Williams, associate professor in that department, who have been key figures in organizing this year's lecture. And finally, I want to recognize the people who each year are responsible for making this event possible, this outstanding event. Catherine Getzen Willoughby is an alumna of our PhD program in Public Administration Policy, and who in the fall will become the Golumbowski Professor of Public Administration. And Dan Willoughby is a graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law. Second best isn't bad, okay? This lecture honors Catherine's parents, who are lifelong advocates for public education and public service. So please join me in thanking the Willoughbys for all that they've done for the university. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce this year's Getzen lecture. Charles H. Ramsey, we were talking over dinner last night about baseball, and I'm thinking that was the warm-up and now comes the pitch, okay? Charles H. Ramsey is the former commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department and former chief of the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia. He's a native of Chicago. He joined the Chicago Police Department at the age of 18 as a cadet. He served as commander of the narcotics section, and in 1994, he was appointed deputy superintendent. A nationally recognized innovator, educator, and practitioner of community policing, Chief Ramsey is known for refocusing the Philadelphia and DC police departments' approach to crime fighting and crime prevention using more accountable organizational structures, new equipment and technology, and an increased emphasis on community policing. Chief Ramsey also co-chaired President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. He was a professor too. He is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from the Lewis University in Romeoville, Illinois, where he has also served as an adjunct professor. Please join me in welcoming Charles H. Ramsey, the 2017 Getzen Lecturer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dean, and good afternoon, everyone. I do have a couple PowerPoint slides, but I promise you I will not kill you with PowerPoint. I've only got 2 slides other than the opening and the closing that I'll refer to periodically, and that's just to give us reference on the topic I'm going to address this afternoon. I was asked to talk about police accountability. I'm going to do that using the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing report that I co-chaired as kind of a framework for my talk, but also hopefully to stimulate some discussion. Because I think the last thing you need is to spend an hour just listening to me babble on. You need to be able to have some exchange of ideas and to be able to talk a little bit, and I hope we're able to do that this afternoon. The dean mentioned that I've been in policing for a long period of time. It's true. You can look at the gray hair and probably tell. I started when I was 18 years old in 1968 as a police cadet in the Chicago Police Department. Now, I didn't grow up wanting to be a police officer. I had nothing against policemen, but I just never thought about being a police officer. My mother was a nurse. My dad drove a bus for the Chicago Transit Authority. In fact, my dream as a child growing up was to become a doctor. Now, I think that was probably due to a lot of the TV programs that were on at the time. I won't bother to name them because I'm looking at the age of this audience, and they say, what? Say who? There's no way you'd even know who I'm talking about. But for those of us old enough to remember, the 60s in particular was pretty much dominated with medical-type TV programs. So how much influence of that, I don't know. But my mother was a nurse, so at a very young age, we used to go to the hospital to pick her up and so forth. So I kind of got involved in that, and I really saw myself one day being a doctor. But I was working at a grocery store in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of the city in a community called Inglewood, which is, it was then and it is now one of the more challenged communities in the city of Chicago. And I was working at a grocery store that was in a neighborhood that, looking back on it, it was a little dicey. But at the time, it was just my neighborhood. I didn't see it as particularly dangerous or anything else. But there were a couple cops that used to come in the store, particularly at night, to close us up because one of them's sister was a cashier there. And so he wanted to make sure that we got out okay, and it was not a problem. Well, over time, we struck up a friendship. And one day, I never will forget, he just wanted to have a little conversation with me, and he said, listen, what do you want to do after you leave here? And I told him my dream was to, go to medical school. I was a freshman at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and that was the direction I wanted to go in. And he said, well, have you ever thought about a police cadet program? I had never heard of it. And he went on to explain that there was no obligation to come on the job. If you were selected, you had to be enrolled in college full or part-time. It was no problem. I was already a full-time student. And the city paid your tuition. Now, some of you are probably scholarship kids. Others, maybe you're not. So you know how important it is if somebody picks up that tab. It is a good thing, and there was no strings attached. So I said, hey, where do I sign up? So my dad and I went down to police headquarters. I signed up, went through a process, and I was selected to become a police cadet. It didn't take long before it was a fit. It was just something about it that was attractive to me. And 47 years later, here I am. But I accidentally became a police officer. Now, I tell that story because a lot of you in the room, students in particular, you may have dreams of what you want to become, and I hope you realize those dreams, but some of you may be uncertain. Don't close the door on the possibility of law enforcement as a career. It's a great career. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later if you'd like. But I've had a very good career. In Chicago, I spent 30 years as a member of the Chicago Police Department, worked in just about every kind of operational unit you can imagine. My dream job then became one day becoming superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. Well, I was one of two finalists in 1998 for the job. My very good friend, Terry Hillard, was selected as police superintendent. Now, in retrospect, that was the right choice that the mayor made. He was a better fit for that job than I would have been. Now, I didn't believe that at the time. I was very disappointed, believe me. But when I look back on it, it was clear that he made the right choice. I was terribly disappointed. But just to show you how sometimes your dreams don't always work out, but as they say, when one door closes, a window opens somewhere else. The very next day, I got a call from a search firm looking for a police chief in Washington, D.C. Now, I had called me maybe 2 months before. I turned them down because I was interested in the Chicago job. Because that's my home. That's where I wanted to serve. And they started the conversation by saying, hey, I'm sorry that you didn't get that job, but we are still looking for a police chief. So after thinking about it, it's our nation's capital, opportunity to serve. For me, it was the right move. And I look back on it now, and probably the best thing that ever happened to me was not becoming superintendent of police, because one, it extended my career, and I never would have experienced some of the things that I was able to experience while police chief in our nation's capital. Not only in terms of trying to change the department around, because it was we had a lot of issues in the Metropolitan Police Department at the time, but I was also there during some pretty interesting times in history. I was the police chief there on 9/11, for an example. The D.C. Stiper case. Some of you may not remember. Most of you probably do that period of time in D.C., 3 weeks in October of 2002, which was it was the most stressful period of time in terms of police work that I've been through in my 47-year career. So I had a chance to experience quite a bit, help plan presidential inaugurations and all that sort of thing. I left at the end of 2006. A new mayor came in. And one thing you learn when you're a police chief, your job is only as good as your mayor's in office. New mayor came in, wanted his own chief, which was absolutely the right thing. I mean, a mayor ought to pick their own chief, no question about that. So I stepped aside. And during that year of retirement, I had a chance to do a little consulting work. I wrote a security plan for the U.S. Senate and for the Convention Center. But I was also part of a presidential commission to travel to Iraq to look at Iraqi security forces, which was very interesting to be in Iraq in the middle of a war, looking at the police there. General Jim Jones was in charge of looking at the military, and it was all to see whether or not they were able to fill the void once the American presence started to withdraw from that particular country. Then I got a call from Mike Nutter at the end of 2007, asking if I'd be interested in serving as his police commissioner in Philadelphia, and I was ready to get back in the business, and I jumped at that opportunity. Philadelphia is it's a great city. I continue to live there today. So anyway, that's a long career. I've been around a long time. I've experienced a lot of stuff, but I by no means have all the answers. Not even close. I'm constantly learning new things. And one learning opportunity that I had came in late 2014 when I was at home. My wife and I was right around Thanksgiving. In fact, she was beginning to prepare the meal for Thanksgiving. She always gets started like a day before, and the phone rang, and it was the White House. Now, that doesn't happen every day when you get a phone call from the White House. It wasn't the president. It was his general counsel, Neil Eggleston. And if you recall, there had been a couple controversial things that happened in policing. Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. You had the death of Eric Gardner in New York City. And all these things were now the subject of viral videos. Police were like the topic of the moment. In fact, if I ever had the opportunity to thank President Trump, I would thank him for getting us off the headlines. Because since he's been president, it's been nothing but just about him and not about police. But that is the only thing that got us off the front page of newspapers and topics on cable news shows. So it was very important that the issue be addressed. The president was very concerned about what he saw going on, and he asked if I would co-chair a task force that would take a look at critical issues confronting police and come up with recommendations. And of course, I accepted. My co-chair was Lori Robinson, a professor at George Mason University. She was the number 3 person in the Department of Justice for a period of time. I had known her for a long time. Hadn't really worked with her as closely as we worked together on the task force report, but a very quality individual, and I was very, very pleased to have the opportunity to work with her. Now, there were 11 people in total that were part of the task force. I had influence over picking 2 of them, and that's it. The rest were all chosen by the White House. We had civil rights activists, civil rights attorneys. We had a couple of young people that came literally off the front lines in Ferguson, Missouri, one in particular who was from St. Louis. She was one of the active protesters there in Ferguson, Missouri. Another very active in what was going on in New York City. We had academics. We had a couple police chiefs in addition to myself. So it was a very diverse group of people. And quite frankly, I wasn't sure if we would be able to come up with any kind of meaningful report if we were spending all of our time going back and forth with one another and unable to agree on anything. When I got the first phone call, I did ask how long we would be given to put a report out for the president's review, and I was told 90 days. Then that just kept shrinking, a little bit more, a little bit more. Finally, when Lori and I had a chance to go to the White House and actually sit down with the president and talk to him about this to get a feel for what it is he was actually looking for, it was down to about 45 days from the time we had our first meeting in January of 2015 to the day he wanted a draft report on his desk. 45 days is not a lot of time to deal with a topic as complex as the one we were asked to deal with. So we had to deal with a lot of things, and we had to think fast, and we had to really come together relatively quickly. We organized the best we could given the time constraints. And what we decided was that we would focus on 6 areas that we thought were key areas to address. And we're going to talk about each of those 6 key areas. Now, you may look at that list and say, well, you forgot this or you forgot that. And you're right. But we had 45 days. We didn't have a lot of time. So we had to do the best we could. One area that in hindsight I wish we had a chance to really touch on, and I think we could have probably squeezed it in, is recruiting and hiring. Recruiting, hiring, and retention. Those are critical areas of concern to police chiefs across the country. But we didn't have time, so that's not on the list, so we really didn't deal directly with that. We decided to have what we called listening sessions because we didn't want to do this in isolation. We wanted to be able to move around the country, and we wanted to hear from law enforcement. We wanted to hear from community folks. We wanted to hear from academics. We wanted to hear from as many people as we possibly could. So we had 7 different listening sessions that we attended in different parts of the country. And we brought in people to present testimony. More than 100 actually physically came and presented testimony. Another 120 were able to provide written testimony. We had to go through all that to get their input, get their ideas, and so forth. And because we are in the 21st century, the sessions were live streamed, so we were able to get input from people that were watching. They were able to ask questions. So I think considering we got quite a bit of input that we had to go through. Now, we decided early on that we wouldn't do this in a democratic fashion in the sense of voting on every single recommendation. One thing the president made very clear, he wanted concrete recommendations with action steps. And that was our task, that was our goal, to be able to provide that to him. But we wanted to make sure, and again, we had such a diverse group of people. It wasn't certain at the time that we'd ever get consensus on these things. But we decided not to actually vote, but to try to just get consensus. Every single recommendation in the report, and there are almost 60 recommendations in the report, about 92 action steps, we got 100% agreement on the recommendations in the task force report. Now, it took all night sometimes for us to be able to talk about a particular recommendation, get the right language that everybody could live with, and so forth. But everyone was totally focused. And, you know, looking back on this, I think it was a good thing we had a short time frame because it forced us to really just spend all of our attention on this one issue and not be diverted by the day-to-day, responsibilities of trying to run a police department or teaching courses or whatever it is that the individual had to do. We had to really focus on getting the job done. We needed to have a report on his desk March the 2nd, and we were able to actually do that. The areas, or the pillars as we call them, and these are in no particular order with the exception of the very first, building trust and legitimacy. And that is because we think that's really the foundation. Nothing else really matters if you don't have that. And that's fundamental to a lot of the problems we were experiencing in policing at the time and continue to experience. Policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, officer safety, and wellness. Those are the 6 areas that we focused on. And what I'll do is just talk and just highlight a couple of the recommendations in each of those categories and not go through every single recommendation. Obviously, if you've had a chance to see the report, you can do that on your own. But I just want to highlight just a couple areas. Building trust and legitimacy. Why did we think that was so important and why we made that the very first pillar? You know, when was looking at many of the instances that happened back in 2014, 15, that led to these viral videos that we all saw. I heard a lot of commentators talk about trust in communities and talk about, the lack of trust, particularly in minority communities, challenged communities, lower economic communities, and they acted as if this is something new. When I was a brand new police officer in the early 1970s, when I actually hit the street, when I was sworn in, there were neighborhoods, I worked on the west side of Chicago. There were neighborhoods we'd go into and nobody would say a word to you. You could cut the tension with a knife in some cases. There's always been tension in some communities toward police. So it's not really new. I think we made some inroads. I think community policing in the 80s and 90s did a lot to try to break down some of those barriers. But I think we underestimated just how fragile those relationships are. And there were still some pockets within those communities where relationships were never really established. But if you don't have trust, if you don't have legitimacy, if people don't give you the moral authority, if you will, to enforce laws or see you in a way or in a light in which you have that kind of authority to tell them what they ought to be doing, then it's very difficult for us to really enforce laws, to provide service, do the things we need to do. And like I tell my officers, it's not the big things, it's the little things. It's being in a marked police car, for an example, and there's a red light. People are stopped at the light. And what does the cop do? Go through the light. Not on a call. Doing it because he can do it, not because he's got somewhere to go. Parking. No parking sign. What do you see there? Police car. You can't park there because that same cop will give you a ticket. But they park their car there. All those things erode the legitimacy we have to enforce laws in our cities. And oftentimes that comes, we don't think about that at the time we're parking the car, we're just trying to find a parking space. Or you go through the light, and just because you just want to get to wherever it is you're getting to, but it's not an emergency where you have to do that sort of thing. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how we treat folks in given situations. I think it's human nature. We tend to remember negative things more than we remember positive things. You can have 10 positive experiences and one negative, and the one you talk about more than any other is the one negative that you had. Okay? Now, this is going to be a very poor example, and I'll say that up front. But I think that everyone's memory of United Airlines will be a little bit different after what they saw yesterday as opposed to any personal experience you might have had while flying, right? I mean, it had that kind of impact. Didn't happen to you, but you witnessed something that was negative, and that's going to stay with you for a period of time, far longer than how polite a flight attendant happened to be on a particular flight that you were on. It's just human nature. So police are in a position where we come in contact with people normally when they're at their very worst. People don't call 911 to say good morning. They call 911 because they got a problem. And so the attitude, the way in which we handle a situation, the way in which we resolve it, is something that really stays with people and has a lasting impression, and it impacts not just that cop, because they probably won't even remember that policeman's name, but they'll tie that agency to that incident forever. And so we have to be very, very aware of our actions and do everything we can to see to it that we handle things properly and that we build trust. Now, community policing did that. I mean, when you got to know individual police officers, and police officers got to know individuals that live in that community. I mean, one thing we started doing in Philadelphia, for an example. Now, Philly is the 4th largest police department in the United States, 6,800 sworn members, another 850 civilian members. So it's a good-sized department. It's a big department. Our officers get in their cars, and you're running from call to call to call. Well, we put an end to that. And we started in our community policing actually trying to give people some time to problem solve. But more importantly, when recruits come out of the academy, brand new police officers, They don't get right into a car. They go on foot patrol, and they spend anywhere from 6 months to a year in some of the toughest neighborhoods in our city, where there's a lot of crime that occurs in open space. Drug use, maybe some gang activity, you name it. It happens in some of the communities. Now, we work very closely with Temple University there because I'm a big believer in research and making sure that we know if something works, why does it work? Temple University did a study. They actually chose areas where we should insert foot patrol, and they had other areas they had identified that were very similar that were used as control areas where we continued to police, but we did not have foot patrol. They found a 22% reduction in crime in the areas where we had foot patrols. So not only is it something that the community feels good about actually seeing a police officer, it actually had an impact on crime. But it did something else. It gave our officers an opportunity to realize something that's very important, and that is in the most challenged neighborhoods we have in Philadelphia, there are more decent, law-abiding people living there than there are criminals. There are more kids living there who just want the same thing as their kids want: a chance to learn, a chance to get a decent job, try to stay out of trouble, all those kinds of things. Now, you don't learn that driving 40 miles an hour down the street in the Crown Victoria, but you learn it when you're out there on the street. And I'll give you a quick example. One of my deputies, my first deputy, was out on patrol, and he sees this rookie cop, and he sees two kids standing next to him, one little girl, and he's on his smartphone. And he stopped because at first thought was the girl's standing there and he's just ignoring her, not really, interacting and so forth. So he, stopped and got out and started speaking with the police officer. Hey, how you doing? What's going on? The girl had stopped to ask him a question about some schoolwork that she had. He didn't know the answer, so what he did was a Google search on his smartphone to get her the answer that she needed for her homework. Now, that's an example of something that young lady will never forget that. That police officer probably will never forget it, but it never would have happened had he not been out there on foot patrol. So that's the kind of positive relationship building that we're able to achieve, and it also builds trust within a community because it changes a person's perception of police. Policy and oversight was another area that we addressed. Probably the most controversial recommendation of the policy section involved officer-involved shootings. We recommended in the report that if there was an officer-involved shooting, that it be investigated by a third party, by a law enforcement agency, but not the one that the officer is from. Now that got a little pushback. We also recommended that a district attorney from a jurisdiction other than the one in which it occurred review it. Now, why do we do that? It's not that the department is incapable of conducting its own investigation. They can. But the perception amongst the public is that it's not going to be objective, it's going to be biased, and so we need to address that. And the reality is, I've been in this business a long time in 3 major cities, and I've seen some investigations of officer-involved shootings that had holes in it, that weren't investigated as thoroughly as they should have been. You have to kick it back and get more information, this, that, and the other. Now, whether it's sloppy or intentional or whatever, I don't know, but I do know it's a problem and it's an issue. If what we want is the truth, if what we want is to really find out what happened and make decisions based on that, then I think we ought to take every step that's appropriate in order to be able to arrive at that conclusion. If that means having an independent review of the actions, then so be it. I mean, to me, that was critical and something that, again, we agreed upon. Now, where we got the greatest amount of pushback really wasn't internally, it was actually from the district attorneys. The district attorneys just flat out said, no, we're not doing that. We were elected to, review these cases here within our jurisdiction and on and on and on. Reality is they take forever. I had cases involving police shootings that it takes literally years to get a letter of declination from the DA's office. And even in cases where it's suspect, it may not be criminal, but it's certainly suspect in terms of a use of force, the DAs were not really quick to really get on it. Now, that's not an indictment of all district attorneys, but certainly there's an issue and there's a perception that we need to be able to deal with. The majority of situations when an officer resorts to force, whether it's physical force or deadly force, is justified and within department policy and within the law. But there are some that aren't. And we've got to deal with that, and we've got to be able to address that. Oversight's another area that was somewhat controversial. Now, there are a lot of agencies that already have some form of an oversight. In our report, we don't say the kind of oversight that a department needs to have. There is no one model that's better than another. But we do say that every community ought to, and department ought to come up with oversight that is best suited for them. I think it doesn't hurt to have oversight. Now, when I was in Philadelphia, the mayor put together an oversight group to take a look at what we were doing. I got involved in something called collaborative reform, which is a way of getting the Justice Department to come in, take a look at what you're doing, come up with some recommendations that you can implement to strengthen the organization. It happened as a result of a spike we had in officer-involved shootings in 2012. We had almost twice as many shootings in 2012 as we had in 2011. Now, I reviewed the shootings, and they were well within the legal justification. But it's an indication that, is there a problem? Is there something with our training? Is there something with our policy that we need to look at? I was aware that they were doing this collaborative reform. I read a report they did on Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and I said, well, why not? So I got them to come in and take a look at our department, which they did, and they came up with some pretty solid recommendations. Well, what the mayor did was he wanted to make sure we were implementing the recommendations, so he created an oversight body, which bothered me at first because, nobody really likes any. It's kind of like, I got to make sure you're doing it the way you should do it, so the little ego gets in there and you don't want anybody looking over your shoulder. But they put this body together, so we were coming up with different policies. We were revising our policies, revising our training, and we sent it to them for review prior to publication. They came up with some good recommendations for us. Why? Because they're lay people. They were reading it through a totally different lens. I mean, we use all the jargon and we assume you ought to know this and ought to know that, but the clarity just wasn't there. And they made comments that really helped us as we revised our directive to make it clear. So there was no confusion at all, either on the part of the public or the police officers, that this is exactly what this policy means. So oversight can be very good. Now, I believe that the final decision ought to rest with the police chief, that this independent body should not be the ones making final recommendations on discipline and things of that nature. That's just me. But otherwise, why are you there as the head of the organization if you don't have the ability to do that? But that doesn't mean that you should not have some form of oversight. It's not an either-or situation as far as I'm concerned. Technology and social media. Some people were a little disappointed that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about body-worn cameras. I guess a couple paragraphs in there deal specifically with body-worn cameras, but I'll tell you why we didn't. There were larger issues that we needed to really at least be able to present and make people aware so that they could at least start thinking about it. Because technology is advancing so fast. Today we're talking about body cameras, tomorrow we're talking about something else. Technology is moving faster than either the law or policy can keep pace with. And so we need to think about the implications of technology in the hands of police. Now, there are policy implications specific to body-worn cameras. When should an officer turn it on? When should they turn it off? Some people say, turn it on at the beginning of the tour, leave it on all day. Okay, fine. But what happens then when we want to interview a juvenile victim of sexual assault? Do you really want us filming that at that particular moment in time? What about when you call us to come to your house because you're having some kind of dispute with your spouse? Do you really want all that on film? What about an individual that wants to give us information confidentially? If you think we have trouble getting information from people now, think about the chilling effect it would have if they're on tape. I'm not saying that we shouldn't tape during these things, but you have to have a policy in place to make it clear as to when it's appropriate to have it on, when it's appropriate to turn it off. But what about some of the larger issues that I mentioned? Constitutional issues. Most departments have license plate readers, for an example. Now, license plate readers are attached to a car. You drive down the street, and it's scanning tags, all the vehicles, to see if there's one that pops hot, stolen car, or whatever. Very useful tool, very useful tool. How long do you think it'll be before there's software put on that same camera? Instead of scanning license tags, we're scanning the faces of every single person that's walking down the street. They're in public space, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And we need to have that discussion up front. Because how are you going to feel when some cop walks up to you and says, "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" "Oh, I'm fine, officer." "When's the last time you paid child support?" You just pop with a warrant. You going to still love that technology? I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but what I'm saying is that if we start putting drones in the air, and we start flying drones around, and we start seeing things in your backyard that we would not normally see because of that 6-foot solid fence that you got, you think there might be some Fourth Amendment issues that we need to at least talk through? The time to have the discussion is not wait until somebody does it and then you wind up with the courts deciding. We need to sit down with the Bar Association, ACLU, other law enforcement professionals, academics, and others to sit down and think these things through and come up with model policies on how to really control the technology that we have in our hands. You know, getting into a database is easy. Getting out is not so easy. So that same license plate reader that went down the street and caught your tag, how long does that information sit in that database? What else could it possibly be used for? These are real questions that we have to be able to deal with, and there are policy implications and there are legal implications, and that's why we didn't just focus on one thing, because we didn't want to date the report. Social media, huge impact on society, not just police. I mean, one of the, these viral videos, I mean, you're hard-pressed to buy a phone that just makes phone calls. They do everything else, including videotape. And so you get these videos that come out. So all of your actions are now on tape. It has a tremendous impact. Information spreads very quickly via social media, and nothing spreads quicker than something that's not true. And so you've got false information that spreads on social media. Good example, the Boston bombings. A lot of bad information was being put out there. At one point on CNN, one of the main reporters said that they had a person in custody in connection with the Boston bombings. It wasn't true. The people were still at large. Ed Davis, the police chief at the time, used social media, I think, very well and had to get information out. No, don't believe that's not true. It's not accurate. We still are looking for the people responsible. So they had to get information out. So he turned it around and used it positively. As law enforcement, police, if we rely on mainstream media to tell our story, we're going to have a problem, because they're going to only negative sells. I mean, they're going to report the negative. But now we have the capacity to be able to get information out to the public ourselves in a variety of ways. And so we need to leverage the power of social media. Just communicating with certain age populations. They don't want to go in a church basement in the evening to sit down and have a community meeting. They'd rather deal with a virtual town hall, let's say, some way of being able to communicate via social media as opposed to the way we were accustomed to communicating with people. You have to do both, because you have a variety of audiences that you have to be able to reach, and you have to be able to tap into all that. So technology and social media is something that we have to get a handle on. And we've got to have policies in place with our own officers so they don't misuse social media. I had a detective in our Southwest Detective Division that was very active on social media, keeping people informed of what was going on in terms of crimes in the Southwest Division. Now, he was doing an excellent job. I shut him down. And you know why I shut him down? Because we didn't have a policy in place on how officers should be using social media. After I shut him down, I called him downtown to the office. And I said, listen, you're doing a good job with this, but I know out of 6,800 cops, somebody's going to do something stupid. It's just a matter of time. So I had him help me develop policy for how social media ought to be used. He was down for about 2 weeks, and then he went back up, and then he helped train other detectives and others on the appropriate way to use social media to get information out to the public without crossing a line. You don't want to put crime scene photos out. You certainly want to be sensitive to witness information, victim information, all that sort of thing. So he was doing it right, but it showed a weakness in the department overall because we had no policy around this sort of thing. And fortunately, he was able to help us put that together. Training and education, another critical area of policing. One of the recommendations that came out of the collaborative reform, both in Vegas and also in Philadelphia, was the way in which we train. A lot of departments, and I don't know about the ones around here, but a lot of the departments that I have been exposed to, especially with recruit training, do a good job of training and teaching the technical aspects of policing. Criminal code, what report to make out in this particular situation, tactics that you use when making a felony car stop, all those kinds of things. We do a pretty good job of training. But what we don't spend enough time on in many departments is the role of police in a democratic society. What is our role? I mean, we refer to ourselves as law enforcement, yet law enforcement is just a narrow slice of what we really do day to day. So what is the role of police in our society? In 1998, when I was a brand new police chief in Washington, I got an invitation from the Anti-Defamation League to come and visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I don't know how many of you have ever visited that museum, but it is powerful. It is very powerful. And I went not really knowing what to expect. It was actually something that was just on my schedule. I was scheduled to fly out that afternoon, so I really didn't think it was a big deal. But as I walked through the museum, I had the honor of having a woman by the name of Irene Weiss with me, and she's a survivor. And she was telling her personal story as we walked through the museum, which just added to the power of what I was saying anyway. And when I left there, it was overwhelming. I knew there was something there. I didn't quite know what it was. So I came back about a week later unannounced, and I took my time, and I went through the museum. And I realized what was bothering me. It was about the third or fourth photograph that I saw in there. And that was a picture of a police officer, a SS officer, walking side by side with this German Shepherd dog that had this crazed look in his eye. And what I realized and what I didn't know was the role of police during that period of time. And it made me start thinking, Germany had been a democratic society. I mean, what happened? That police officers who took an oath very similar to mine became part of something so horrific. And then I started thinking about the role of police in a democratic society and protecting the constitutional rights of all people and how important that is. Yet you ask a lot of police officers, what's their role in society? The answer you get oftentimes is enforce laws. How about the first response being to protect the rights of all people? If we looked at our jobs that way, all these issues and problems that we're talking about now would start to go away. Because it's not just the rights of individuals that we deal with that are victims of crime, but it's the rights of the accused. It's everyone's rights. And what happens to a society when we no longer fulfill that responsibility? That's the real issue. And we created with ADL and the museum a training program that focused on just that. And it went from just the Metropolitan Police Department going through it to now more than 130,000 law enforcement officials have gone through that training program. FBI, all the federal agents, they go through that, and now we're working on trying to expand this nationally. The African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., we've been in conversations with them now to have a very similar experience and a very similar exposure. Because when you do those kinds of things, you kind of put the role of police in a context that makes some sense. The other part of that, and I have a program that we started at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. I stopped in there and spoke to the person who runs that training program and learn what they do. And they basically have a training program where they trace the evolution of our democracy from the Declaration of Independence all the way up until today. And what I asked her to do was, let's take a snapshot in time of police during that same time frame. Well, 1776, you didn't have organized police forces, but you might have been, if you were in the South, let's say maybe you were tracking down slaves. If you were in Boston, maybe you were night watchman checking doorknobs or whatever. Fast forward to the 1960s. Who was it that was waiting for the demonstrators that came across the Pettus Bridge? Police. The point I'm trying to make is this. History can teach us an awful lot about why there's more tension in some communities toward police than in others. And it's because we carry certain baggage. Police have not always stood on the right side of justice as we would define justice today, looking at it through a 21st century lens. Now, I'm not indicting I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is that we have evolved, we have changed, but the baggage we carry is still there. Those negative stories get passed down from generation to generation. You've got to know that if you want to overcome it. And so the point of that is a history lesson in understanding the role of police. So that's part of the educational component. It's not just about teaching or training people on how to do something. It's really kind of understanding something in a much larger context. Community policing and crime reduction. The reason we had the two together is because there are many who feel that community policing cannot lead to crime reduction. I'm not one of them. I believe very strongly in the concept of community policing. In fact, I think part of where we started to really go a little bit astray as a profession, and this again is not every department, but with some departments, we became so data-driven back in the early 2000s that a lot of us backed off of community policing, real human interaction that needs to occur between police and community. I remember I would go to community meetings, and New York City, for an example, was having these huge reductions in homicides. I mean, in 1992, I think it was, they had over 2,000 murders in New York City. Last year, they had, I think, less than 400. Nobody would have ever thought that New York could ever cut into homicides that deeply. So you go to community meetings, and what do people want to ask? How come you're not doing what New York is doing? How come you're not doing this? What is this CompStat thing? How come we're not doing it here? So what do? We started doing it. And so we started becoming very data-driven. Was it effective? Absolutely. As Bratton used to say, put cops on the dots. I mean, it does make a difference. You can deploy in a very fluid way, and you can stay on top of crime trends and patterns and all that sort of thing. But you shouldn't do it at the expense of the real human interaction that takes place. The other thing that's important is that when we come up with these crime-fighting strategies, broken windows, nothing wrong with that. It's been very effective. It's had some positive results. But you got to think about the collateral damage some of these things cause when we implement certain types of strategies in a community and how it impacts the part of the community that we're there to protect, not the ones that are actually causing harm. And so we need to think about that, and that's why it's important that we work with community when we get ready to implement these strategies so that we have an understanding as to what we're doing, why we're doing it. You know, I think about broken windows for an example, and again, it's something that I've done myself, but I don't think we had a strategy in place for what happens once the window is fixed. It's no longer broken. So you can't continue with the same kind of strategies that you used before once the problem is starting to subside. How do you get the community more involved in sustaining it? How do we start pulling back a little bit and start engaging in other types of things that we need to engage in order to keep our community safe? And so that was a big topic there. And then finally, the very last one was officer wellness and safety. And we wanted to put this one in because of some of the real issues affecting policing that maybe some people are not really aware of. Now, I'm not talking about officers wearing bulletproof vests necessarily, although that's part of it. But I think we've pretty much gotten to a point where most departments have policies. Most officers wear it. They don't hesitate. I know when they first came out, back in my day, it was hard to get cops to put on a vest, particularly in the summer. But I don't see that now. I see them wearing, and I see them doing what they should be doing in terms of protecting themselves. Getting them to wear seatbelts all the time, different issue. Some do, some don't. But that's not really what we were focused on. What we were focused on was the mental health of police. Now, that's something that goes largely ignored in many departments. Not all, but in many. You know, we do this stuff as police so often and for so long that you become desensitized to much of what you see. You aren't even aware that you're being exposed to trauma. I've been to more homicide scenes, well, I worked in homicide, but I've been to more homicide scenes that I could even begin to talk about. That's not normal. And it has an impact on you psychologically that you may not even be totally aware of. You go to jobs where, you know, some child's been sexually abused, and you got to deal with the parents, you got to deal with the child, you got to deal with all this stuff, and you got kids at home. I had a young policeman that had 3 years on the job. Him and his partner got called to a disturbance call. They get there. A woman opens the screen door and hands this officer a baby that she had just decapitated. Now, that officer couldn't even come back to work. He had a small child at home. I mean, come on. You get exposed to stuff that you don't even realize the impact it's having. And I don't, you know, if a cop gets shot or stabbed, we do a good job of getting them the kind of medical care they need and everything to get them back up and moving. But what about the wounds that you suffer here? You know, post-traumatic stress disorder isn't something that's just, you know, soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Try doing this stuff for 20, 30 years. Try going to the call after call. We talk about, you know, overreaction on a part of some police officers. Yeah, you become hypervigilant. If you work in some of these areas where you're constantly barraged with shootings, with rapes, with all the kinds of stuff going on. And again, it's not everybody in that community. We know that. But you're hearing it over and over again on the radio, and now you get dispatched to a call, you'd be a little hypervigilant. And so how do we deal with that so that we can kind of take some of that stress level down so people make good decisions out there on the street? That's what we have to find a way to be able to do. Because when you look at police as a profession, we have a higher rate of substance abuse than most professions, a higher rate of suicide than most professions, a higher rate of domestic violence than most professions. Why is that? And we need professional counseling in order to help. 2008, January of 2008, I took over as police commissioner in Philadelphia. 2 months before, on November 1st of 2007, a Philadelphia officer was shot and killed when he interrupted a robbery at an establishment. Before he got a chance to do anything, the guy just shot and killed him. So the department had not gotten over that. Beginning in May of 2008 through February of 2009, 9-month period, I had 5 officers killed in the line of duty. All separate incidents. 3 were shot to death. 2 died as a result of responding to felony and progress calls. You talk about trauma, you talk about having an impact on an entire department. I mean, it was just one right after the other after the other. We reached out to the University of Pennsylvania's behavioral health department, and we got some real professional counseling put together and made everybody go through it. And we started with myself and my command staff. We were the first. Why? Because, 1, I needed it, and 2, the stigma that's associated with mental health is still there, like it or not. And cops are afraid of losing their jobs. I mean, they have badges, they got guns, they get involved in stuff out there. Can you imagine if someone was able to say, oh yeah, you're going for some kind of psychological treatment, or you're on, meds or whatever. I mean, it's a legitimate concern that they have. We got to be able to figure it out. How do we provide assistance and help, and at the same time allow them to function, allow them to do their jobs? So we spent a lot of time talking about that particular aspect of policing that oftentimes gets overlooked. Those were the 6 key areas that we addressed. One part of the training that I failed to to talk about, and I'll just touch very briefly. Most departments now have courses on fair and impartial policing, which includes implicit bias training, procedural justice, courses like that, I mean, in my day, we wouldn't even know what the hell that was. I mean, procedural justice, what do you mean? You know, and so we're starting to get into those kinds of things and really help officers better get a grasp on how important their role is and so forth. So that's all part of training, and that's all part of there. One thing that I was disappointed with President Obama, the very first recommendation in the report was that there be a commission or a task force formed to look at the entire criminal justice system, not just police. The last time that was done was 1965, when Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. And a lot of the folks in this room, that's just a name you read about in your history books. You weren't even on the planet when Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. It's time we took a comprehensive look at the entire system, because it's not just about police. It's about the entire criminal justice system. It's about the drivers of crime. We got to get serious about poverty, education, housing, substance abuse. We got to get serious about all that stuff. Solving the opioid crisis is more than just buying Narcan for police officers to spray up somebody's nose as overdose. And that's not going to fix them. That's a disease. They need treatment. And we've got to find a way to be able to deal with these larger social issues if we really want to have a better impact, a greater impact on our society. President didn't think he had enough time in office to get that done, thought it would take too long. I disagree, but I lost that argument after all years as president. Now, do I have some concerns today? Yes. This isn't partisan by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's too soon to tell which direction this administration is going to go in a variety of issues. But I get concerned with some of the talk, immigration for an example. People should come to this country legally. There's no question in my mind about that. But there's a way of dealing with it in a humane way that takes a lot of factors into account. I'm not for splitting up families. I'm not for doing a lot of that kind of stuff. And we've got to find a solution. You think that doesn't touch trust and legitimacy? If we get involved personally in this kind of stuff, how are we going to get people to feel free to call us? What if it's not them that has a problem with their immigration status, but it's a mother, an uncle, a brother, or somebody else? There's already indications, and granted it's early in the year, but I was talking to Charlie Beck, the chief of LAPD. They've seen a 25% decline in the number of calls to report sexual assault coming from the Hispanic community in Los Angeles than they had at the same time last year. Now, maybe it's just fewer sexual assaults, but you need to really look at that and figure out, is this because people are just afraid to call? 15% reduction in domestic violence calls in the same community. Does this have anything to do with the other? I don't know. Opportunity for some research longer term. Maybe it's not enough time passed now, but universities and colleges can play a huge role in taking a deep dive into some of this data that we collect on a regular basis to kind of really get at the heart of some of the things that's going on. But I'm concerned about that. When I hear things like, well, you know, we may not do any more consent decrees, or we're gonna take a long, hard look. I don't have a problem with taking a long, hard look, but there are some departments out there that really benefit from a consent decree. And I'll give you an example, Baltimore. The chief in the city, Baltimore, said, no, don't delay it, we want it. We need this in order to fix the things in our department that need fixing. Now, this is the police chief and the mayor. And I know Kevin Davis very, very well. And he told me that. No, we need this, because if we don't have this framework to operate, if we don't have the ability to be able to make some changes happen, then we're not, this time next year, we'll be having the same kind of issue, the same kind of problem. It's not one size fits all. Can the Justice Department get a little aggressive sometimes? Yeah, I think so. But that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's an opportunity here to take a hard look, and there are ways in which you can help a department turn if they need turning. Because many departments are doing very, very well, but there are some that need help. Collaborative reform, I thought, was a good way of doing it in a way in which is not nearly as complicated or as intense as a consent decree. So when I hear things like We're not going to do that sort of thing. We just need better law and order. We need this, that. I mean, been there, done that. Law and order is no way of saying, let's just go out and just start locking up a whole bunch of folks again. Now, there are some people who need to be in jail. And believe me, I'm not a person who just spends a lot of time staying up at night because I feel so much empathy for some of these guys out here doing harm in the communities. There are some that need to be in jail, but there are others that could benefit from alternatives to incarceration. There are some that could benefit from being given a second chance and reentry to be able to come into mainstream society, but we have to make an investment if we're going to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to get more of the same. And so I get concerned when I hear these things. But I also want to be optimistic in believing that, things can really move in a positive direction. I think there's been a lot of positive things that have happened in our profession. I just want to see them continue. I was pleasantly surprised at the number of departments that have read the report of the President's Task Force report and really started implementing many of the recommendations. I was pleasantly surprised, and I've gone to a lot of different cities around the country, and there's a recognition that status quo is not acceptable, but at the same time, you can't indict an entire profession thinking everybody's bad, everybody's this, everybody, because it's not true. Can we improve? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is a framework or a guide anyway that people can use to achieve that. So with that, I know I want to leave time for a Q&A. So thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. That's an excellent question, and it really touches not only on trust and legitimacy, but also policy. Police handle a variety of things. You can get a 911 call about a couple kids standing on a corner or an abandoned car in front of someone's home. Or you can get a call like they got in Orlando a few months ago at the Pulse nightclub where you had an active shooting situation. Totally separate types of responses are required to require different training and different equipment. Do police need some of that heavy equipment? Yeah, they do. But the policy has to be in place as to when it's appropriate to deploy it. A peaceful demonstration, for an example, is not where you deploy armored vehicles and all that sort of thing. I thought that it was an overreaction initially in the Ferguson case, for an example, a guy with a tripod and a rifle pointing at. None of that was called for. But you got to have the right policies in place. Now, does every department need some of this equipment? Maybe not, but regionally, maybe so. Because you never know where something like that's going to happen, and you need to be able to respond very, very quickly and very effectively, and that's going to require different kind of equipment. I mean, it was a what we'd call, I think it was a Bearcat armored vehicle that actually broke the hole in the wall at the Pulse nightclub that allowed officers entry to take out the offender. We get bomb calls. We use robotics now. Some of that comes from the military, get it from that 1033 program, surplus equipment that they have, where instead of having a human being go to investigate something that you think could be an IED, explosive device, or whatever, you've got a robot that can do that for you so you can stay out of harm's way. You need that kind of equipment to be able to do it. So the term militarization is one that kind of bothers me a little bit because it paints a different kind of picture. The real question is, what kind of equipment do we really need? And then what's the policy in place to make sure it's only used in the appropriate circumstances? That's really, to me, the issue, because it's not, to me, an either-or thing because of a range of kinds of jobs that we get called on. Active shooter in schools, things like that. You need equipment that would not normally be carried on patrol, but you need to have it. Yes. There's training called Crisis Intervention Team Training. Many departments are using it. I don't know if you guys use it. I imagine you do here. CIT training, 40 hours, where you can identify people who may be going through some kind of mental health crisis. It's got good de-escalation training as part of it. How do you resolve it short of using force to bring a person into custody? departments across the country. It actually started in Memphis, Tennessee. The Memphis model is what it's actually called. But it's a collaboration with mental health professionals and police training. Now, having said that, that's a larger issue, and that is something that my good friend Dave Brown said in Dallas after the murder of the 5 cops. Sometimes we get called upon to do a little too much. Now, it's not just police. The largest provider of mental health services in the United States are our jails. Now, what's wrong with that picture? The LA County Sheriff is the largest provider of mental health services in the United States. That is not what they're there for. Yet by default we have it because the system and governments across the country have failed in their responsibility to actually fund the proper facilities, professionals, and others to take care of these folks. So by default, we wind up with it. Now, that's not going to change us responding necessarily to that initial call with somebody who's off their meds and that sort of thing. But how do they get long-term care? How does it stop from being a repeat call for service? Because they go in for 48 hours or whatever your law allows here on an involuntary admission. But then they come out and they go right back off their medications. Now, there are some cities that have community policing where they actually partner with mental health professionals, and they're the first to get dispatched out to these kinds of calls. And in addition to actually responding to the call, they actually visit these folks in street settings. I mean, many of the homeless people out there, not all, but some have some kind of mental health issue, but they tend to stay in certain areas of the city. They don't move around a whole lot. These same teams go by and they visit and they say, "Hey, Joe, how you doing, man? You still on your meds?" They can look at them until early on before they start to act out if they really need intervention at that point in time. That's another way in which community policing can help. By knowing people, knowing that this person has a problem, and when you see them, just check on them, check on their well-being. How you doing? Everything going okay? And it doesn't take long in a conversation before you realize that maybe they're not taking their medication like they ought to. So what do? See to it that they get what they need. That's better than responding after they do something that could cause them to come in contact with us on a whole different level. And so, but the bigger issue is why is it we don't address mental health the way we ought to and leave it to the jails to be the provider of mental health services when they don't have the skills, they don't have the funding, they don't have anything. That's not what they're there for. Yet it's true, and that's exactly what's going on. Any others? Okay. Yeah, it's past time. It's past time. I'm a huge proponent of education for our police officers in a variety of ways. Formal education, informal. I'm a huge proponent of it. Yes, the answer is pure and simple. If you want better policing for the 21st century, it starts with leadership. And you have to develop those leaders of the future. Many of whom are not current deputies or whatever. They're even young people that are aspiring to get into the profession. Some are at the entry level or they're sergeants or whatever. But if you don't develop them, and that's another thing, leadership in policing happens more by accident than it does by design. Because real leadership development programs, mentoring programs, all those kinds of things that we ought to be doing to groom that next generation of police leaders, some people are fortunate enough to have somebody in their life that does that for them, but there are many talented individuals that don't. And then we have this antiquated system where the only way you get to the top is going through this examination process, sergeant to lieutenant to captain and so forth. And not everyone who can pass a multiple choice exam is really a leader or someone fit to lead others. But it's the only game in town because the only way you can get more money is by going through the promotional process. So we have people that take tests not because they want to be supervisors, but because they need more money for their family. So they become sergeants, lieutenants, whatever, smart enough to do it, doesn't make them leaders. We don't spend enough time on leadership development, and that's what we got to do. We got to really focus on developing leaders, and leaders are at all levels of an organization, not just at the top. They're at all levels of the organization. So there's got to be an investment there. And so it's past due, long past due, that there be an effort in that area. And I don't suggest waiting for the federal government or anybody else to do it. I think we have a responsibility as police leaders to do everything we can to encourage our people to provide seminars, things that we can really kind of get them interested in going back to school and continuing their education.